I want to start this video off by saying the maps series of videos will be coming out at some point in the future. Things keep changing with them, and it's getting increasingly more difficult to determine what's more important to include and what's not. The amount of effort being put into it has burned me out of making it slightly, and this video proved to be easier to make in terms of time sensitivity and effort involved in taking down statistics and screenshots and whatever. The need to know is essentially it's coming. Eventually. Just not yet, because the script for it is getting pretty large. The first recording session for it was 43 minutes, and I'm tossing it completely because I don't fully like how it came out, so yeah. That's basically the gist of that. So, anyways, I'm not the first person to make this video, and I'm not going to be the last person to make this video, but let's talk about something every single multiplayer video game has. Matchmaking. Something World of Tanks has never really been good at doing, if I'm being honest. Gone are the days of +5, -1 for light tanks, sure, but also gone are the uniqueness of light tanks as we knew it. That's another issue for another time, which I'll make a video about at some point as well. As for matchmaking itself, most of the kinks it had in years past have been ironed out. Most does not mean all, though, and several issues still remain, some of which you may not even realize exist until I mention them later. I'll talk about each problem individually, as well as play some devil's advocate to share reasons some of the problems are seen as fine as they are. Let's start with the elephant in the room, and probably the reason you clicked on this video in the first place because you knew I was going to bring it up at some point. +2, -2 matchmaking, otherwise known as 357 matchmaking. People keep telling me that they're different things, and fundamentally, they're really not. This system has been in the game longer than you may think, though it has been in its current state since April 2017. Coincidentally, or not, the same update, they added Tier 10 light tanks, which, again, is a story for another day. Just to reference how long ago that was when they added it, this was the same patch that they let you use consumables more than once. This was also the patch that added stun to the game, which, let's not even talk about it. This was also the patch before the Badger was brought into the game, over 6 years ago. The balance of tanks was a lot closer back then, so having a 2-tier spread wasn't as significant as it is now. This was a time where the WZ-5A was the best tank in the game, and we all know how it scales up in the present day. It's not what it used to be, and it hasn't changed at all. The game gets balanced around the matchmaking and how tanks interact with other tanks. Premium tanks, which we'll talk about in a minute, have to be balanced in such a way where it's appealing to buy, but shouldn't be so ridiculously good that it overshadows everything else. This presents one of the core parts of balance you have to maintain, as well as, honestly, the biggest issue the game has right now. When a tank comes into the game, you have to try and make the statistics of it good enough to be able to kill tanks 2 tiers higher than it without being strong enough to the point of endlessly massacring tanks 2 tiers below it. Most tanks are alright when it comes to splitting the difference, but some tanks are either only good when top tier or seem purposefully designed to fight tanks 2 tiers higher than them. Some tanks aren't even good when they're top tier, but that's more a problem with the tank itself at that point than anything matchmaking could do to help it. The problem created by this combination of making tanks that can kill tanks 2 tiers higher than them, but also can be killed by enemies 2 tiers lower than their own, is that Wargaming often forgets about letting tanks 2 tiers lower have any fun. Excluding typically tank destroyers, most tanks nearly cannot pen other tanks 2 tiers higher than their own, even in the average set of weak spots, which are often small considering lower tier tanks have worse accuracies. On the other side of the coin, most of the tanks that can't be reliably damaged take half the hit points off of said vehicle that can't pen them or more. What ends up happening as a result of all that is that games where each team's top 3 tanks effectively decide the outcome of the match, based solely on their performance. Even battles where the bottom tiers fill the gap that is left by the top tiers, it's often not enough to make a difference in the battle. In other words, it's a battle to see which top tier tanks survive longer than the others. The team with the surviving top tier tank then, more often than not, just wins. Unless by some miracle they can get killed by a bottom or mid tier tank. This is where we start to see effectively unwinnable games. caused by a complete or near complete inability to kill certain vehicles, if they're in even moderately convenient situations for their tank. Even with premium rounds, which largely exist purely to fill the potential gap of not being able to penetrate tanks that may have a generous amount of armor, many vehicles still fall flat, even firing ammo that costs anywhere from 14 to 20 times as much per shell, and does sometimes an eighth of the damage. Now, I don't expect mid to bottom tier light tanks to be able to front pen top tier heavies, but I do expect them to be able to have even the slightest chance of causing damage somewhere. Expecting tanks that are 2 tiers lower to fire gold ammo at higher tier tanks just to have a chance of penning is a really bad balance to have, just straight up. Sometimes it's not even enough. Like this game, for example. This is a video I posted earlier this year, and this pretty much details exactly what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this video. This has multiple things wrong with it, as in the matchmaking, but for now, this is the AMD 178B, a tier 6 French light tank that deals 110 average damage per shot. It has 120 millimeters of pen with AP rounds, or 160 with APCR rounds, with 0.38 base dispersion, which is pretty bad if we're being honest. It has 300 meters of base view range and 640 hit points, which really isn't particularly great. And those are VK101Ps, a German tier 8 super heavy tank with nearly 3 times the hit points, a caliber of gun that overmatches the AMD literally anywhere, with HE rounds that essentially have a 50-50 chance of one-shotting the AMD. It has 130 millimeters of side armor, 120 millimeters of rear armor, and 100 meters more view range than the AMD. These two tanks can and do see each other in battles every day. They very likely do not interact with one another, as they're supposed to be in different parts of the battlefield completely, but the problem still remains. The problem isn't really why can't an AMD fight a VK101 reliably, but more what if it has to? That is how we end up in this situation. You could probably guess with shocking accuracy how this battle will go, based on my initial reaction to seeing the team lists load up. Oh yeah, did you see the message I sent earlier about the radios?
Yeah, having a radioman from an untrained crew only drops view range by...
How are we supposed to win this game?
2 VKs and a BZ?
How are we supposed to win this game? Like, physically, how... They send a BZ railway, which we can do nothing about, and then they send the 2 VKs to the city, which we can also do nothing about. How do we win this game? I mentioned the AMD versus the VK100, specifically because it happens at the end, but we could take any one of these other tanks out of this list and put it into this situation, and it won't be pretty. Again, the point I'm trying to make is not, why can't one of these tanks just kill a VK100? The point is, what if it has to? What if there's no other option or choice outside of fighting a tank that is physically unkillable to you? Now, take that problem and put it on a team anywhere from 4 to 6 more times, and you can see the problem, right? Up to half of each team often has very little to no impact on the battle, simply because of the tanks they spawned in. Obviously, a good player knows how to make the most of a bad situation, but some bad situations are just unsalvageable, no matter how good you are. The short version of what I just said is that over half of each team doesn't matter, effectively ever, save for highly specific situations, such as light tanks on Malinovka maybe. The sheer difference between your average tier 4 and your average tier 6, or your average tier 6 and your average tier 8, is larger than the difference between your average tier 8 and your average tier 10. While it's not strictly matchmaking related, the increase of premium tanks with very generous levels of armor is becoming an issue. What ends up happening is tier 8 tanks are being created to have armor built to survive tier 10 matches. Those supremely armored tier 8 tanks end up fighting tanks at a lower tier than their own, which causes this kind of tank imbalance to happen. A lot of tier 7s even struggle to fight a lot of tier 8s, for the same reason we stated before. This issue goes all the way back to when tanks like the Defender and the Chrysler K were added to the game, and many, many tanks have been added based on a similar concept since then, gradually getting more and more foolproof levels of armor. As we go, the only purpose of these vehicles is to give players good games versus lower tier vehicles, as they're nearly completely ineffective to higher tier ones. I've heard this as a theory a few times, and we'll discuss it later as well. And while I can't say it's true, I can't say it is false either, simply because there's no way I could possibly know this. So, tinfoil hats on for this one. A lot of players seem to believe that +2 matchmaking only still exists as an excuse for players who aren't very good, to put it nicely, to still get good games in their tanks, which keeps them on the hook. I don't think this is true, simply because the number of games that end up with one top tier tank having a fantastic game while every single other tank gets destroyed, save for a couple people who manage to salvage a good game, that's a bad statistic. When only 1 out of 6 top tier players has an enjoyable experience, the positive experience of the 1 would not outweigh the possible negative experience of the other 5. Even in single tier matchmaking, one player having an amazing game at the expense of many other players is not a performance ratio Wargaming would want to encourage their matchmaking system to follow. So while I don't know the exact reason as to why +2 matchmaking still exists, I'm fairly confident that that is not it. A simple solution to more or less all of these problems that we've just talked about is to simply remove +2-2 matchmaking from the equation entirely and make every tier ±1. The balance tier to tier gets significantly smaller and the greater impact every tank has on the battle. One of the more practical and often overused reasons for +2 matchmaking's existence is because of queue times. I speak for everyone when I say waiting up to 2 or 3 minutes to find a match in any game is very undesirable. It's extra undesirable when the match may last all of 4 minutes. Let's be honest, we've all done that. We wait 2.5 minutes to find a game and it lasts 4. So it means you spend a third of your time waiting to find a match. The unfortunate part of this system is that Wargaming only has the desire for fast queue times by the looks. That's what their matchmaker program is designed to do. You will often get thrown into very imbalanced matches in terms of what tanks everyone has, solely because there's priority set on finding a match as fast as possible. It could be a terribly balanced match in every single way, but hey, it only took 3 seconds to find a game. Matchmaker won't imbalance these games on purpose, save for one potentially hidden mechanic that may or may not exist in some capacity, which we'll touch on in a minute, that is both potentially an imbalance towards the team that has that or against the team that has that. But it will never purposefully imbalance a battle for any reason. It's incredible people still think that they have anything to gain from it, since nobody enjoys steamroll matches, which, by the way, will happen no matter what system they have. Rigging a match for one player at the expense of the other 29 players is such a massive net loss in terms of player interest that it would be completely just player-based suicide if they were to ever publicly say it was something that existed in any capacity. They stand to gain nothing from it, and as is such, it doesn't exist, never has, and never will, because it is such a bad idea for overall just everything. This kind of 3-second queue time is designed for quantity over quality, which is often a problem when you consider a lot of the other factors matchmaking is programmed with. It matches tank type to tank type and tank tier to tank tier. Note, I said those as different things because the matchmaker sees them as 2 different things. If one team has 7 tier 10s and 8 tier 9s, the other team will have 7 tier 10s and 8 tier 9s. That is a hard rule of the matchmaker that never changes, though it used to be different a long time ago, which that was pretty rough. Likewise, if one team has 6 medium tanks, the enemy team will also more often than not have 6 medium tanks, sometimes 7, sometimes 5. This system is good on paper, but in practice spawns 2 main issues, as well as a third that might actually be an intended mechanic, but there's no real hard evidence of it being that. The first issue is splitting tank tier and tank type as 2 different things. So yes, both teams get 6 medium tanks, but one team may have 4 tier 10 mediums and 2 tier 9 mediums, whereas the other team is split 3 and 3. This happens all the time at every tier to every class besides artillery and light tanks. And this issue gets amplified by the second issue, which is not all tanks are designed to do things the same way. Let's create a battle the way matchmaking sees it, shall we? This is my interpretation of how this goes, and while it may be very incorrect, it seems like this is how it goes more or less every time. We have a whole bunch of tank destroyers over here at different tiers, as well as mediums, heavies, light tanks spread out as well, and some arty as our pepper just to spice things up slightly. What matchmaking will do for all of these tanks is just pick a tank and put it on a team. I'm not sure if it creates both teams at the same time, or if it creates one team first, then assembles a second team to match the first one. Alternatively, just grabbing 30 tanks at once, and then just having it filter through and create a team within these certain guidelines. Regardless of which one of those it is, the numbers line up the exact same to the system, and it sends everyone into a battle. On the surface, this looks fine. A couple exchange tanks here and there, it's not the end of the world, right? Well, most of the time, it ends up being somewhat fine. Nothing too crazy happens outside of the occasional brawling tank destroyer being put on a mostly heavy team anyways. Depending on the map, this can swing the entire battle's outcome or end up not really mattering that much in some instances. You'll have matches of completely mismatched tanks for the map being played, which I must emphasize is not common nor intentional. It is a problem with the matchmaker, but it is not intentional. The problem lies with the matchmaker treating every tank of every class as equals within their class, excluding, kind of, light tanks and SPGs. It sees 2 tank destroyers and goes, here's 2 tank destroyers, I'll put them against each other, and calls it done. The problem of that, of course, is that one of the tank destroyers was a Grill 15, and the other tank destroyer was the T-110E3. Now, on Prokhorovka, or similar, this may not matter too much, depending on what the Grill 15 does and how the battle shapens out. But what happens if you get Berlin or something? One team effectively gets a very, very strong brawling tank, while the other team gets a typically useless one. Treating every tank in a class like they're all the same is doing a great disservice to the variety they offer, and deciding not to value that variety is causing a big problem with the matchmaker. Let's go back to that AMD battle for a second, to compare which teams got what heavy tanks. Here you can see something matchmaking can do correct, which is match a tank versus itself. And here we can see the matchmaker not doing that. Just from this picture, you can tell there's either no system in place trying to match the same tank against itself on purpose, or at least one that is very, very low priority when creating teams, if it's not completely random at all. If there was, there'd ideally be a good chance for each team to get 1 VK and 1 VZ. At the very least, the top tier tanks should be more balanced, right? This, of course, is ignoring the fact that more than 2/3 of the tanks in this battle can't pen any of these in any practical situation, but, you know, that's also why this is an issue. Speaking of the matchmaker, not having a system to put the same tanks across from each other, let's talk about the exact opposite, which may or may not be a feature as well. Tank stacking. And not in a rigged way, either, or even close. There's reasonable cause to believe that there's a mechanic of the matchmaker, which I have no hard proof of this, I just see it happen all the time. It'll see the same tank more than once, and it puts all or most of them on the same team. There's a very good chance it's also completely random, but it just feels very common for it to stack 3 or even 4 of the same tank onto one team. All it takes to see this was to queue up a tier 3 game in the months after holiday ops of last year, and you'd be greeted by entire teams of Saharianos everywhere. But only one of the teams would have Saharianos. The other team may have like 1 or 2, but the other team would have like 9 or 8. Granted, tier 3, it doesn't really matter, but when there's teams of 7 or more Saharianos with none on the other team as often as it was happening, that's oddly specific. It happens way more than it should if it was a completely random spread of tanks. I'm not gonna say for sure it's a real mechanic the matchmaker takes when creating teams, though. It might be an unintended shortcut that it takes when making teams sometimes, but it happens common enough for me to consider it as a problem. Some tanks get exceedingly deadlier when there's multiple of them on a team, as well as mismatching becoming even worse because of its possible existence. When one team gets 3 T110 E3s, and the other team gets a 4005, a Sturv, and a Jagdpanzer E100, it can be pretty tough. Likewise, a team getting 4 Batchats on a map where flanking is not exactly easy isn't so good either. Now, very good players can and will make it work, but assuming something as rare as 4 good players are all playing the same tank, end up on the same team, and manage to turn the game around because of their likely random wolf packing? The odds aren't 0, but if it's the length I would have to go to make a counterpoint, then it kind of shows how unlikely this is. Long story short, when you wrap a combination of possible/accidental tank stacking in with +2 matchmaking, it creates imbalanced matches. No matter how hard people want to claim it's on purpose, it's not, but it's still a problem. Some people I talk to don't think of it much of an issue, and they've given me a few reasons as to why, which we'll get to in a second, but an important thing to note is a lot of the people I ask stuff like this to tend to be some of the better players in the game, as their opinions are likely more accurate to what realistic situations are. Draps, for example, Mr. Monkey Man, doesn't see much of an issue with the existence of +2/-2, largely because he plays predominantly tier 10, so it doesn't affect him in any way. When he doesn't play tier 10, he'll play mostly tier 8s for either credits or marks. Since there's a higher tier enemy to farm, or for him to fight in some situation, there's more potential damage and credits to be earned, leading to a larger net profit at everything. While all of that is quite valid, it's also important to note that Draps is literally in the top 0.001% of players worldwide and is fully capable of defending himself and fending for himself in any possible situation he may or may not be in. If you're not Draps, playing like 20 games or more a day with win 8 averages of 3,700 or higher on average, then you're in the remaining 99.999% of players. Things don't work the same for everyone because we all play a little differently, and our opinions vary as much as does the significance of what's important to us. That's called being human. People who like marking a bunch of tanks probably have little to no problem with +2, while people like me who don't really care for that stuff see it as an issue more often than they might. All of that wrapped together is just a long-winded explanation for the points I'm about to discuss may not apply to everyone, as most of them are taken from players who play and have played at a very high level. They know how this stuff works because they've done it for a very, very long time. So, of the notes I've gathered, in no particular order: tank diversity on the battlefield, queue times, gun marks, enhancement matches that for quote-unquote bad players, otherwise known as new premium tank validation, dynamic battles, teamwork, and player skill offset. For each of these, I'll explain the likely thought process about why these points were brought up, as well as my own counterpoint for each of them, detailing what would change for the better under a +or-1 system. We've already talked about some of the points, but I'm already gonna mention them again, just because while we did touch on them, I want to clarify why they apply to this as well. So the first point here is the first point because I honestly didn't even think of it while making this video. It was something that was brought to my attention by Max, actually. The inclusion of an extra tier's worth of tanks on the battlefield adds a lot of diversity to the tanks you can see in your own tanks. The knowledge of those tanks' strengths and weaknesses often means a player will need to improve to remember how to take down certain enemies, which also isn't a bad thing. However, the counterpoint to this one's very simple, which would be if I never have to fight a Barask or a Skoda T56 or a BZ176 in my tier 6s ever again, then I can gladly live without any benefit tank diversity would give the game. If you're a Cromwell, the most dangerous tank to fight in +2 is like a Barask or a Skoda T56. If you're in +1, the most dangerous tank you can fight in a Cromwell is like maybe a Tiger 1, T29, SMV, Chiteau SP. A tier 5 tank can currently fight a Tiger or T29, and they really don't stand a chance, especially against something like a Chiteau SP, which just brutalizes them without mercy. In +1, that changes to be an OI or a T34 D5M. Tier 9s will no longer be fighting tier 7s, tier 6s will no longer have to fight tanks that get CVS while they can't use it. There will likely be less arty in battles, though not by a significant margin, as the tier they'd be at would change and that's it. They would still be in the queue. What this change allows wargaming to do is balance tanks in such a way where everything is fairer for one another. Instead of having to create tier 8 tanks that have to survive fighting tier 10s, they only have to fight tier 9s. What this also does is effectively remove preferential matchmaking, which wargaming themselves have openly stated to be a problem with the matchmaker for years and years at this point. There's a reason they've not come out with any preferential tier 8 premiums in a long time. That's because they've been an issue in the matchmaking for a very, very, very long time. I said it before as well, but it would also allow every tank to have a greater impact on the battle, just by default. Considering the balance of tanks is closer, that means each tank impacts other tanks more, while the whole of the game stays sort of the same in terms of how it might progress generally. Only difference now is that instead of fighting tier 8 heavies in your tier 6 medium, you're fighting tier 7 heavies, and there's a big difference. Point number 2 is something I briefly talked about before, but queue times. This is my front-running reason for why they've not removed +2 yet, as it seems to be the only thing the matchmaker actually prioritizes in really any way. As I said before, no one wants to wait like 2 to 3 minutes to find games, because there's no guarantee they last longer than 5. While marking the EBR Hotchkiss, that's basically how it went for me every game. I would wait 2 minutes to find a game, because there was no one playing the tank and it could only get matched against itself. And then the battle might end, honestly, sooner than I found a game. I may wait 4 minutes to find a game, and 9 of my team would be dead, and not even 3. So, yeah, no one wants to wait that long to find a game. Like I said before, though, getting put into a completely horrible match after 3 seconds is not any better. Why even get put into the match when my tank can't effectively do anything without firing premium shells at everything? EU servers really wouldn't see a difference in queue times during normal to peak hours, as they have enough players for that. The NA server queue times might get noticeably longer, but more than likely won't become a non-stop queue time simulator if this change were to go through. I'd honestly be fine waiting like 30 seconds a game if it was a guaranteed plus or minus 1 match or same tier match for everybody. Since being put into a +2 game in tier 4 to 7 means you basically useless the entire game. Like, you really can't do anything. The short version of this is basically, what's the point of even loading into a match where you can't make an impact, no matter how long you've waited for it, whether it's 3 seconds or 5 minutes. A lot of people care about gun marks, and most marks are easier to get if there's more hit points in the battle. And it makes sense as to why, because, you know, it would just make it easier for some people. Likewise, the opposite's true, where their tanks are harder to mark if they're top tier versus less hit points on lower tier tanks. I guess the counterpoint for this one is, who cares, besides a very minuscule amount of people? And it really isn't a reason for +2 to exist. It's such a minuscule and specific reason to, and like, if for the entire system to exist off of that, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And it only matters for such a small portion of the community that I was debating even considering it for this whole lightning round thing. It would honestly benefit from +1 probably more, because then when you do get top tier, instead of fighting 3 top tiers, 5 mid tiers, 7 bottom tiers, you fight 5 top tiers and 10 mid tiers, because the mid tier is the new bottom tier. You'd have way more hit points anyway, on either side of the coin, whether you're top tier or bottom tier. Enhancement matches is one of those things I did mention earlier as well, and why it would be a truly horrible idea for wargaming to enforce it in any way, shape, or form. The short reiteration of that is basically just having games be borderline rigged to benefit one player in one game out of who knows how many they play is just not a thing. There are a lot of battles that get played in this game. I've been in over 41,000 of them. Some people have been well over 100,000. By sheer nature of playing enough games, people will have great ones. It's not really included in the list of things I mentioned, but I did just remember that there were theories a long time ago. Like many years ago, I think before 1.0. When you bought a tank, your first game, or first few games, I guess, had a higher chance of being top tier. Even if this does exist, it's such a specific mechanic that it just ultimately doesn't matter. While there might be a little incentive to give someone a push in their first game at a premium, I argue there's probably more incentive to sell someone the tank in the first place. Wargaming also likely doesn't care what you think of a premium after you've bought it, since you already spent the money. That's why every single advertisement for every single new premium that comes out mentions nothing bad besides it has a lot of armor, but it's pretty slow. Otherwise, you're not really going to have anything negative about any premium tanks because they want to sell them. Dynamic battles is a term Wargaming keeps throwing around, and yet they seem to be absolutely terrible at actually doing it. With the addition of more maps designed around the same principle, as well as some maps being changed to match that principle, they're not doing too good in the whole dynamic department. While they're not explicitly stating what they mean by dynamic games, I presume it's something along the lines of varied yet still interesting and moderately predictable. I can't say +2 adds interesting gameplay for any party involved in the vast majority of cases. It is certainly predictable though. I'd argue single tier games are more interesting since every tank is a potential threat to each other in some capacity, more so than if it was a +2 game. Even in a +1 match, the tank balance gap isn't high enough to a point where a tank would be worthless. I can't really think of one where that would be the case. And that sounds more interesting to me, at least, since it would lead to more competitive games with more competitive tanks in every single match. Teamwork has largely been written off in random games as more and more people lose faith in teammates, and honestly, I can't blame most people these days. The idea of the team has to work together to kill these powerful tanks just doesn't work, since people aren't willing to work together in the vast majority of cases. Also, when this tank can two-shot the ones trying to kill it, it's easy to see why people would rather fend for themselves for a longer game rather than risk a high chance of dying to save a teammate. Relying on random people working together often works as well as you'd expect, especially versus higher tiered opponents who often can just kill them both anyway. Player's skill offset is basically a category of all the times I've been told people just need to play better to fill the sharp tank disadvantage. Anyone who's played a tier 6 tank versus a Barask can attest it often does not matter. Tier 6 lights having to face a tier 8 medium that beats their view range, camo, speed, damage output, and can mount CVS is just ridiculous. Heavy tanks are in a similar situation, when there's nothing stopping a Skoda from tearing apart tier 6 heavies besides its reload. You may think, oh, he's just naming the best tanks at the tier, but it's not really just the best tanks. Pretty much nobody would say the Bisonte or T-32 are overpowered, and yet tier 6s struggle against them a lot. It's like a boss fight where there's no attack patterns, you have no idea what it's going to do. In addition to that, said boss kills you exceedingly faster than you kill it, and it's impossible to even put pressure onto them a large percentage of the time. You also get a boss on your team, but your boss could be significantly easier to kill or be significantly easier to fight because of their decision making than the enemy boss, if you know what I mean. This is basically how a T-95 works though. If a team can't wrangle enough firepower together to kill a T-95, they often just lose whatever flank a T-95's on, because they can't kill a T-95. Another core issue is that the culprit with these games a lot of the time is tank mismatches, which we did extensively talk about earlier, but not too specifically to what I wanted to actually prove my point to be. Because I did mention it, but I never explicitly said this is the problem. Tank mismatching has a bad habit of treating every tank destroyer, heavy, and medium alike. Now, anyone who's ever played the 50B can tell you it's not a heavy tank. It might not even be a medium tank. It might be a tank destroyer. To a certain degree, because you can play at any range, but you don't want to brawl with it. I won't really get into it again, because you'll see more examples of it that explain it better than I can with words, and also I've already talked about it to death, so we'll just skip that whole portion again. But I will share what it looks like. In this game, the enemy got a Turtle 1, which just got buffed as of patch 1.22, because I'm still working on this video for 3 weeks. But it's a very strongly armored tank, even before it got buffed. And very few tier 8s can pen it frontally without hitting the lower plate or occasionally the cupola, which is pretty tough to hit. Our team got nothing. I could tell right at the start of the match that our team would struggle and we'd probably lose simply because we couldn't kill the Turtle 1 and we had nothing to kill the Turtle 1. You can also see a problem with Matchmaker where there you got a Turtle 1 and we didn't get a single tier 8 tank destroyer in general. I am going to have to bleed that Turtle as much as like physically possible here. Which is not a sentence that's good in any other context other than this one. He's just gonna drive like this, so we gotta... Yeah, okay, this guy next to me gets it. Fun gaming experience, I gotta say. I knew this turtle was just gonna win this game. Because we didn't get anything that can fight that in the slightest. Yeah. This one's just matchmaking, honestly. We had nothing that could fight their clearly, at least slightly, advanced Turtle 1 player. Sure enough, a couple minutes later, the game is essentially over, and guess why? This is just another result of the matchmaker not taking different tanks seriously, and in more ways than one. If I did go through and pick out every single battle where this kind of thing was the case, we'd be here way longer than we already are. So I'm not gonna do that, but you get my point. This is not a rare occurrence, and it's especially bad with tank destroyers. Especially since most of them are brawling tanks, but a good, 50% of them aren't at all. They're really not good at the front line unless they're fighting maybe tier 7s, and that's a maybe. In a completely different topic, a bit of a fun fact, actually. Did you know that Wargaming once added a system for matching tanks of the same type versus each other? So, if one tank was a, let's say, sniper tank destroyer, and one was an assault tank destroyer, that wouldn't happen, or at least it really shouldn't. It would match a sniper tank destroyer versus a sniper tank destroyer. And I don't mean classes. I don't mean a tank destroyer and a tank destroyer just fight each other. I mean the roles themselves. If you go into the onslaught menu or ranked for the bonus experience, this is also what determines their field mods, is their classification. This has existed ever since the same update that brought the Badger in the game was 3 patches after the matchmaker, the one that we have right now, came into the game. It's obvious this system doesn't currently exist, and I'm not sure when it got removed from the game, if it even existed in the first place. But it hasn't for quite a long time. It has never existed during the age of EBRs, at least, since wheeled light tanks got their own classification and yet would still get matched versus tracked light tanks all the time. This system was allegedly added in October of 2017, and while there's no given date of removal anywhere since, it definitely no longer exists. If it does, it's set to a very, very, very low priority, and oftentimes I just can't even tell the difference if it's even trying or not. A simple solution to this issue is, well, how do I put this? Maybe you actually add it to the game? Maybe? Right? I know this is a mind-blowing concept, but maybe if the system you said was added to the game actually was in the game, it might do some good. Potentially, they actually did add it for a patch, and then the next update or something along the lines just removed it, but they've never bothered to actually check to see if it's still there. The matchmaker hasn't changed since that patch, so it's likely they've not even thought oh, maybe it's not working intentionally. Either possibility is equally likely, honestly, and either reason results in the same problem, and they should fix it. So this survey I ran for about 2 months, just had some general kind of questions. Looking at it here, just when did you start playing World of Tanks is the first question, just because I want to see how many people were here for that whole +5 -4 thing that was originally in this game when they needed faster queue times. This is something they touch about in their actual matchmaking video, so if you watch the one where we go through all of that stuff that is being uploaded in conjunction with this one that isn't edited nearly as much, you'll see that one of the notes they make is they only had 20,000 players total on the Russian server and they needed fast queue times because not a lot of people had tier 10s, stuff like that. So I just wanted to see how many people were around during that period, just to see Do people remember what we used to have compared to now? And yes, a lot of people do. What is your favorite tier? How do you feel about the current matchmaking system? Which matchmaking system would you prefer? If you were guaranteed a single tier match or similar, how long would you be willing to wait? What tier performs the worst against vehicles 2 tiers higher than it? And then some general kind of catch-all responses to anything else they want to mention about the matchmaking, or because I also like throwing in random stuff, their ultimate breakfast, just because why not? So from the survey results, I believe that is about 60% of people were playing prior to this matchmaking system being implemented, which means most people remember the days where like a tier 4 light tank would get against tier 8s and stuff like that. So general baseline, people remember like what we were going up against back then versus now. So this was kind of interesting. What your favorite tier was almost a dead even split besides tier 7, and no one picked tier 1 to 5, which was kind of funny. But it's pretty much dead even split. We have 3 of them at 17%, and then a lot of people enjoy tier 9, like myself, but, you know, I'm one response in this survey, so. And yes, I filled out my own survey, because I'm a person, and it really wouldn't weigh down the results at all. So this one was also kind of interesting. So how do you feel about the current matchmaking system? Quick math in my head here. I believe that is 73, just under 74% of people say they at least moderately dislike it. And 7.5% said they moderately like it or higher. And then 19% were indifferent. So 3/4 of the people that responded to the survey at least moderately dislike the current matchmaker. That's a lot. That's a lot. So if people had to pick between plus or minus 1 or plus and minus 2, 87% of people that responded to the survey said they would rather have plus or minus 1 be the highest tier gap that you could have, which I'm not surprised, honestly. I am mildly surprised that it is that steep of a margin, because I was expecting, you know, like, again, 75% said they dislike the current matchmaker, but I was not expecting 87% to say that they would rather have plus or minus 1 over plus or minus 2. I was expecting the majority to be plus or minus 1, but I was not expecting that much of a majority for sure. But yeah, 87%. That's a lot. That's a lot of people. If you were guaranteed a single tier match or similar, how long would you be willing to wait in the matchmaker? So I will be fully transparent with this. I do kind of regret the wording of this question. Because it really doesn't offer the response of, like, I wouldn't want to wait that long. Because it is up to 15 seconds, up to 30 seconds, up to 60 seconds, as long as it takes, provided I find a match, and then none of the above. And I probably should have put a response that said, I would rather get into a game quicker than wait to find a closer match, or something along those lines. So, here you can see the results of that one, but keep in mind, I don't really know what to really draw from this. Other than there's half the people that responded to the survey would be willing to wait 60 seconds to get into a single tier match or similar. Which I think that's significant, but again, I think the wording of the question was a bit messed up, so that's my bad. And then this was honestly the most important question to the survey, in my opinion. What tier, in your opinion, performs the worst against vehicles 2 tiers higher than it? 71.5% of people said either tier 6 or tier 7. And if we include tier 5, I think it's at exactly 75% of people said tier 5, 6, and 7. But if we take out tier 5, it's like 71%. 71% of people saying tier 6 and 7. So you can definitely see the issue is something to do with tier 8 a large part of the time. Part of that is due to tier 8 getting CVS, and tier 6 and 7 tanks do not. My suggestion for that is just don't have CVS work against tier 6s and 7s. Just have them be immune to that. I think that would be fair. Honestly, because the 6s and 7s have to deal with that already. So I think that would just be fair to have 6 and 7s not get affected by CVS. The other thing is the balanced tier 8 tanks clearly being designated to fight tier 10s. Tier 10s have to fight tier 8s a decent number of the time, and vice versa. Unfortunately, tier 6s have to fight tier 8s as well, and you can see, as reflected in the survey, yeah, people really don't like that. So there's also an extra question of just anything else people wanted to say about the matchmaker, positive or negative. Or alternatively, you put down your ultimate breakfast, because I like just having someone respond to it, because they may not have anything to think of, but just for craps and giggles, they might think it's funny to put down something else, which I'm not really going to read any of the breakfast ones. One, because I don't want people to get hungry, but two, because it's not related to this at all. People also sometimes wrote down, like, I like trains, which is funny, but also not related to either. So I'll have AI read some of these because I don't want my tone to affect them, but also because they swear sometimes, so.
Reward tanks should be weighted differently than standard tech tree tanks. Matchmaking when it comes to tank types, like TDs versus TDs, sure. But when you give one team 4 TDs and out of those 4, 2 are grills, 1 is STRV and the other is a fuck versus 2 Asian 2v4s, good luck lol. Thanks for giving them basically 4 more heavy tanks to allow the enemy team to make a push easier. Personally, if we cannot have +1, -1 matchmaking, I would like to see the tanks balanced 1 for 1 in the matchmaker. By this I mean if one team gets a Chi 4 279E or S-Conk, then the other team should get one of each as well. Also, I would like to see the ability to 3-man platooning of light tanks abolished all the way down to tier 4. The same could be said for not allowing more than 1 or 2 lights per team also. And as a side note, I don't want to see players be able to 3-man platoon in tanks like the BZ-176. The question for guaranteed single-tier matchmaking is answered with none of the above, because in an ideal situation you do not get a guaranteed single-tier matchup, because there is a system that gives plus 10% bonus XP to your base XP every tier you go up. Tier 6 shooting tier 8s equals 20% bonus XP. It also dismisses the underdog/domination type matches, since everyone would be equal, which gets boring/unbalanced real fast. It's a whole undertaking if we're talking about skill based, but some variety in tiers isn't bad. Too much makes it hard to understand certain roles in that match. Bacon and eggs with toast and more bacon.
Thanks, Craig. I mean, he's not wrong, so.
Although +2/2 is an issue, the biggest issue it seems is the imbalance of the matchmaking. I decided to take notes one day, and out of 70 battles I had 13 that were +2 and only 6 that were -2. This is what makes it feel like ruining your session. Playing a whole day and seeing a significantly higher amount of bottom tier games. Sure, +2 will always feel bad, but if it was balanced with a similar amount of -2 games it wouldn't be as much of an issue anymore. Cause although people really don't like +2, everyone loves getting those -2 games where they can just steamroll a bit. Now, 70 games is not statistically significant, so perhaps it all converges on an even distribution in totality, but that's not helpful in this case. The relevant metric is how many games the player will see in a day or a session. That's the span it needs to be balanced across. +2/-2 is good because it provides more difficulty to the game, and I feel more rewarded in -2 than in the same tier matchmaking. Tank destroyer matchmaking sucks. Sometimes I don't like the team balance. Slow tank team versus fast tank team, one team with many meta tank, and the most complain is the matchmaking while doing campaign. Let's say doing Mount 15 mission on 260 campaign, make 3.5k damage to TD. but in every battle there's only 2 Grill 15 or Scorp G. The matchmaking feels like against the mission. There are some tanks at the same tier that are effectively over 1 tier different in stats. Example: the BZ-176 vs T-32 and Skoda Premium Heavy Tank vs AMX CDC. Player skill has to be relatively the same for the matchmaking to be fair. +1 matchmaking would be nice, but +2 matchmaking allows for better XP grind. The matchmaker puts 2 vehicles of the same class together, but not subclasses. For example, the game will put an AMX 50B against an IS-7 on a map like Himmelsdorf, or against a Chieftain on Westfield. Not fun. Matchmaking should never take skill into account, and shouldn't try to match vehicles 1-1. Artificial fairness in this way is boring. If there is an issue of 2 Chiefs on a team versus 2 IS-7s, then this is a tank balancing issue and not a matchmaker issue. Matchmaking shouldn't try to compensate for vehicle/player strength in any way. Fix the tanks equals fix the matchmaking. Tier 8 requires full gold if you meet tier 10s, and even then the pen isn't enough, so. Also, you should try bread rolls and milk mixed protein shakes and then go for a workout. Limit the amount of lights to 2 per team and limit the amount of tank destroyers to at max 4 per team. It is not just the tier spread that people hate. It's also the tank/player balancing per term. For example, when you have one team with all hull down heavies Kron/Super Conk/Chieftain against a team consisting of subpar heavies in comparison, your team is already at a disadvantage even before the map and player skills come into effect. So it's the stacked upon, stacked compounding issues that really break down the matchmaker. If the MM was more balanced tank to tank, and players equally disturbed across teams, the 2-tier spread would become less of an issue. +2 is becoming much more of an issue to power creep. There is literally no reason tier 6s should see things like Boros, Skodas or BZ. I'm perfectly fine with the matchmaking the way it is. The biggest problem with it, however, is the crossover point between tier 7 tanks not having CVS and tier 8 tanks who can have CVS. It creates a large power difference since you can't really shoot what you can't see, and said non-CVS tanks will likely only spot a CVS tank on a suicide run, which likely won't help the team anyways. +2-2 is one of the worst ideas WG has had. Why do I have to play my stock tier 7 against Concept 1Bs? It makes no sense. I would like to see a +1 would make battles way more enjoyable. As from Pref MM tanks, give them Apex MM where they will never see anything higher than their tier. It's well established that Pref tanks are about half a tier lower in terms of combat ability than their same tier counterparts. As for premiums, the only ones that may be a little too good for +1 would be tanks like the T-56, Bora, and BZ-176. Ultimate Breakfast is just a fat stack of bacon. Full team of good players versus team of bad players, unequal matchmaking. I wished they rated the tanks not just if it is a heavy, because not all heavies are the same. Like all assault TDs on one side and sniping TDs on the other, and it is a city map.
Someone also wrote the last song that plays before my stream goes live, and I figure they're going to be watching this video and they'll think it's pretty funny that I mentioned this, so kudos. So I did want survey results for a few reasons. One was just because the video is very biased by whoever makes it. In any topic, not just this. It doesn't matter what the topic is. The video will be very, very biased no matter what, because it's being told from a perspective. That's why channels like Kursgesagt or whatever the pronunciation is, it's in German, so I don't actually know the exact pronunciation, but that's why channels like that are so good. So I wanted to collect survey results just to see what other people were thinking, but also some of the points that people made in those extra comments are stuff I didn't even think about. Like whoever said that they picked none of the above because there's an XP coefficient that gets applied when you get as a lower tier tank fighting higher tier tanks, which then affects mastery tanker badges. Like, I never thought of that. Sircon made a video like this, but a lot shorter and with a lot less, data points and stuff 4 years ago, at least, when it was only like 2-3 years old. So my two overlying questions about the matchmaker. One, does that role system thing even exist? Does it pick like support heavies to match support heavies? Does it pick versatile tank destroyers to match versatile tank destroyers? And if it does, set it to a higher priority. The second thing, how does it create the teams? How does Matchmaker form the teams? Does it make one team first and then assemble a second team? How does it go about doing that? Because if it assembles one team first and then a second team later, this is how we might end up getting teams that have like 6 of one tank on their team with no platoons. It happened in pretty much every game mode. It was happening in the winter ice skating mode. We had a battle with 6 Object 260s on one team. 3 of us were in platoon, which did create the 3 of the 6 being on the same team, but logically it would just put the other 3 on the other team in any realistic situation. But Matchmaker decided to put 6 reward tanks on the same team. That is so oddly specific. To me, that can't be accidental. That has to be the Matchmaker just seeing that, picking it, and throwing them all on one team, because that's a rare tank being on one team 6 times during a special event with no real incentive to pick it other than it going fast, and that's really it. So it just feels too specific sometimes, and I would love to know what team, like how they form the teams. Those are my two overlying questions with this that I wish were answered, that unfortunately do not get answered in the matchmaking video. Bit of a spoiler. This was my TED Talk, inevitable. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk thing, but this was my very, very long-winded video discussion about why matchmaking, to me, is an issue and what they could do to fix it. So, I will not be uploading a video this long in quite a long time, pretty much until the maps video comes out, because I have spent easily 2 months or more on this video, and that is too long for anybody to spend on anything like this. So, I hope you enjoyed, and if you're still watching at this point, you probably did. Hopefully you did. I invite anybody to also do their own reaction to this video, although it's probably way too long and you probably won't make it that far, but if you do, kudos.